Okay, so I have a couple students exploring various modeling techniques. They've been looking at things online. Of course, everyone gets into the edge loop modeling workflow, which is great. Nice, clean topology, but also it's a technique that takes a lot of practice. Back in the day, I would never, ever, ever teach my students anything related to Boolean, but increasingly, with remeshing tools and volume builders and things like that, that can be a pretty good strategy, especially for mechanical things. So I built this just a little bit ago, and I'm not going to do something exactly like this, but I'm going to show the basics of this idea, something similar. I want to also stress that this is all, at this point, generative or non-destructive, I guess is maybe the better way to do this. So if I went in, I have a shoulder piece, which is this, and this arm. It's just the way I was thinking about it. And if I go in, let's check this cylinder here. This is all in Cinema 4D, and they're all still, I haven't made anything editable at this point. Certainly there would be some advantages later on where I could customize the shapes, but right now what's great is I could say, I want that to be that shape. And I have these other, objects in here that are basically cutters, right? So maybe I want to do something like that. Right? So there are a few caveats to this. When you get big old fat polygons, n-gons like this, you can get some shading errors. There's ways to try to deal with that. That I will talk about, little options. It might tweak some of these settings here. But at this point, if I'm using this approach, it's non-destructive. It's all totally editable, right? So I can come back. Maybe let's go back to this cube here. Maybe if I'm like, I don't really like how smooth that is. I want something more faceted. Maybe I'll make my radius just a little bit smaller. And let's just make that 2 or even 1, right? So maybe that's the more industrial look that I'm going after, right? And that's pretty nice. I like how it did all its rounding there. And the other thing too is the bevel is all happening at the very top here, based on basically connecting all these objects together, and before it works its way up this chain, I can go to the bevel here and let's change this offset to be really tiny, right? So it's really, really tight. I can make this a little bit bigger. Right? If it gets too big though, based on whatever the geometry is, you can see that it'll make errors, right? It doesn't know how to, it can't manage that beveling with that set up. I think I had this at 0.5, right? And maybe I want this subdivision, maybe I don't want as much rounding in there. I'll just put 1, right, or 0, right, where I want that just kind of flat edge there. So there are some caveats to this. You can run into little problems here and there. But as a whole, I think it's a good way to get used to modeling and hierarchies. And then again, when this is all said and done, I can... let's see, right, so I can connect this object and I get one big old polygon object that I can work with here, right, so it has all these pieces. So if I needed to come in and try to address these, I could make some edits. I could come in and select new pieces of geometry in here. Inset, and do my whatever little modeling I want from here. The one thing I would say about this approach that I'm talking about is I probably, if I knew I was going to do this in layers, I wouldn't apply the bevel until I'd done all the extruding, all the little pieces. That bevel is really this last uniform thing to make sure that I get on all the edges that are across here a nice little bevel on it. There are other ways to handle that, but anyways. So why don't let's just undo that a little bit. In fact, let's just delete that object. I'm going to leave the example one, right? I'll just leave it there. But let's just go show how this would work. And I'll just go up and create a cylinder. Let's put this on its side. So let's make it along the positive X, and I don't know, let's make the radius, no, let's leave it at, yeah, 25 is good. And 10. Maybe a little bit more, 20. Okay. And I'm also going to just create a cube. Working all in object mode here. I'm not going to make any of this editable. I'm just going to do it kind of on the fly. Okay. In fact, in the interest of maybe doing it differently, right? Okay, so I have this object here, and I have these in here. Let me hide everything else so we can see what we're doing. Okay, so the way this works is a Boolean operation that's either addition or subtraction or intersection. Underneath the generators command, there's the bool. And the bool is set up as a default to take A and subtract B. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's take our cylinder and put it in there, and then let's put that. So you can see this is cutting away from that object. And again, it's all non-destructive, so maybe I'll make a big opening out of this. Now, the one thing about this is I'm not going to put it, at least at this point, in any kind of subdivision surface. So if I want more smoothing out of this, you know, if I want a totally smooth piece around the segments here, you know, I want to do something like that. The other trick with the Boolean models sometimes is how many of these additional edges do you need in here? Sometimes it's helpful to have some of those for later on in case I have to make some modeling corrections, right? So I'll just put that in there. In fact, let me, just so I can demonstrate this part, let me put it so that I just have this opening there. All right, so this is that bool, right? And I could also do unions, right? I can glue these together, or it would show me the part that's remaining from that, or one part that gets cut out without whatever the B cutter is, right? But I'm just going to do subtraction. And then the other part of this is I'm going to put the bool into a little null object. Now the reason I want to do this is I'm going to use a bevel deformer. So just under the deformer, bevel, and we're going to put this at the very top of the stack. And so what happens here is all the object comes up to the bool as it works its way up, and then the bevel is applied. At least that's the way I think of it. I check the documentation if it actually is doing it that way. Excuse me. But there's one problem here. As you can see that it's beveling in here. In fact, let's maybe make that a little bit smaller, but let's add 3 subdivisions. So I'm getting a bevel out here where it's smooth. I'm getting a nice little bevel in here, but it's not doing that at this intersection. And honestly, I don't know why this isn't the default, but if I click on the bool, there is create single object. When I do this, it fuses the whole thing, and when it comes up to the bevel, it gets what the bevel is doing is saying anything that is greater than this threshold, I'll go ahead and press the bevel. So let's maybe do the cylinder, and let's just go back to what's the default, 16, right? So kind of a little boxier, and just so I can demonstrate, if I pull this threshold down, you can see it eventually bevels every single edge where there's anything over 19 degrees, right? Which is what that is doing there. I can go back to cylinder. Maybe I'll do it like I did before. Let's just make that 8, right? So that's a good looking piece. You will see there also, the last thing about this is you can see this shading error that is happening here. Let me make this redshift, it is, and let me put I already have a metal material. I'll just put that on there, just so you can see the reflection error, right, that's happening in this the space. And the way that we deal with that, in the Boolean, this one little create single object, I would say in most instances you want this on, right? If I go to the bevel, the one thing that I almost always would put on is the Phong break rounding. So instead of it trying to smooth round just because of the way this bevel is happening, if I turn that on, it understands that this is a flat polygon here. So I won't get that shading error on there. I can get shading errors elsewhere in renders and stuff, but I find you almost always want this on. There's a bunch of little settings you can look at for how the shading happens because of the bevel, but I would say as a default, make sure that one's checked on and make sure this single object is checked on. Okay, all right, so that's one piece there. And the nice thing about this is let's create another cylinder. And we'll put it on its X. Let's make it 5 and 25. All right, so, and again, let's make this maybe 5 sections, right? Okay, so I'm going to take this cylinder. Now remember, the Boolean says A subtract B, so here is A and B is subtracting it. I could also just put this down in here as a child, and I can keep piling up objects that I want to be in here that are cutters. In fact, usually what I would do is put a null object in here, and I'll just put all of these pieces, right? All the cutters that I want. So if I want another cylinder, and you can see this little error happening right here, right? I'll come back to that, and so that it lines up similarly, I'll just oops, wrong 90. There we go, 180, so I get that pointing that direction. Now, I'm going to do one more here. Let's do this, another cube. Let's make it 10 by 10 by 10. So I'm just going to put this there, and I'm going to use this as a cutter as well, right? And everything disappears. The issue here is that it's intersecting with another cut, right? So in the order of operations, there's a couple different ways you could stack this. I'm trying to keep this fairly simple. You can also see that I get, well, this is working, but it doesn't understand this intersection here. I guess from a simplicity standpoint, what I would say is try to make your first set of cuts, right? And anywhere where you need to make compounding cuts, right? A cut into something that you've already cut out. What I would do is create another Boolean. So I'll put that up here. So I will take, where's my little, this is my cube. Oh, this one, yeah. Put that there. I'll put that one there. I'm going to put these both into this Boolean, right? So that I'm now saying all the stuff that happens for this bool will now be A, and this cube now will be B, right? So you can see that it's cutting into it, and it's cutting in the way that I want. It is making that error. So again, every time I use the bool, I don't know why it's not the default, create single object. Right? So you can see now I have this this one in there, and again I'm just going to add the null object, so that I have one here. Maybe I'll duplicate this, and I'll move that over into this space, right? So now you can see I get right. I mean, these are just very interesting shapes on top there. Now, depending on the level of detail, you can see if the bevel gets too thick in places, you can run into problems. I'm just going to make this 0.3. I just want a little bit, right? Just enough so that when I render, you get those metallic edges, right? So it shows off and it doesn't just look like thin little paper edges. You can see this would be difficult shape to model, to set up. You do want to be conscious of where these fall sometimes within, like where the underlying, you can see this here, right? Where it intersects, you can run into some problems. All right, so where am I at here? That really is kind of the basics, right? You can go, let's do one more. Let's do a tube, and this time we'll base this on the positive x again. And I'm going to make that a little bit smaller. I'm going to make this way smaller. Let's bring this in just to manage it a little bit more. Right, so I want to create a little grooved cutout in here. So again, this is kind of like a second level of cuts. I might run into a problem here based on this cutter here. Let's just see. Actually, that worked fine. Right? And maybe this one I want to be very smooth, so I'll just make this 64. Right, so this is kind of like what I was modeling a second ago. So again, the nice thing about this is it's non-destructive. You can kind of work multiple layers through all of this. To get shapes and pieces that you want. You can take this a long way, and again, there are some instances where you'll run into problems when you have curved surfaces. So if I were to take one last one here, let's take a sphere and make that 10. Right, so, oops. So you can run into little issues wherever these intersections happen. I'm not actually, this one's doing okay. So for example, if I were to start shaping and tapering an object, I want to make sure everything's planar. I think maybe that's the main thing I want to stress here, is that this polygon right now, if I were to look at it on the side, would be totally flat. But sometimes when we yoink these points around, you get a non-planar polygon. That's where you're going to run into some issues with the shading. All right, let's just finish this one off. Let's say it's a right, and you can see where it just doesn't want to interact with that one there, but it's okay with these because that's all these options have come up to this bool. They've created a single object, and then this bool is functioning as working on that, right? So this is cutter level number 2. And this is a little tricky, but it's doing it. It's tweaking just a little bit right there, right? Right, so you can see sometimes this is a little delicate where you have to put these pieces together, but that would be pretty difficult to model right out of the gate. And once you turned this into its own piece of geometry, you could come back and maybe clean up these edges. You don't need those, or you can make this run in a different direction. But yeah, that's not bad. All right, so Boolean modeling, let's recap. It's non-destructive, so you can try a lot of things. Perfect for mechanical modeling. It's got lots of parts, so you can really experiment, which I really, really love. And you can stack these up, right? You can do bools within bools to make that happen. Just remember, almost always turn on this, until you find a reason why it's not working, turn the create single object on, right? And, I guess you can turn on the break here, right, at those intersections. And then for the bevel, I always make sure Phong break rounding is turned on, right? I'm not going to get into all these other settings for that. Okay, just under 20 minutes. Happy modeling.